Hello everyone, this is Frosty Turtles. This video series is going to be showing everyone how to get started with programming in JavaScript and HTML to make video games. This first video is going to primarily focus on how HTML affects the page and how you can manipulate some HTML elements with JavaScript. So to start with, the program that I'm going to be doing this in is brackets, just because it's easier for me to show the live preview and show you what I'm writing at the same time, so we can see real time like what happens to the page. And this series is going to mainly be for my niece, who I'm not going to refer to by her name. I'm just going to refer to her as T. She's asked me several times to show her kind of how to get started with programming. I've been busy a lot, so I think it's just going to be easier for me to record this and then put it up on the web, so that way she can watch it whenever she gets time. Okay, so getting started, what we're going to be looking at right now, or what we are looking at right now, I should say, is an index page, which is generally an HTML page. On the index page, you'll need to have this tag up top, which is just jock type HTML. There are various forms of this tag on the top that you can put in depending on what exactly you're doing, but for our purposes we're going to focus on using the standard HTML. And then you're going to have the HTML tag, which this is actually, the HTML tag is what defines the page over here. And we're going to define it as English, and then the XMLNS is referencing w3.org. There's various parts to an HTML page. The first part is the head, and the second part is generally the body. I believe, if I remember right, you put the footer, because there should be a footer tag. Yeah, there should be a footer tag, and I believe that can be put outside the body, but now that I think about it, that's probably not the best choice. So we're not going to do that quite yet. Okay, and then you'll need to set the meta char set to UTF-8, so that way most web browsers can interpret what's going on. There is a title to the page, which as you can see, there's the what do we call these? The title tag, I guess you could say. And without having anything written in here, if you look at the top of the screen where my mouse is pointing, you'll see that it's 127.0.0.1:66620 index page. Now the reason that that's showing is because it doesn't actually have a title to the page. When I type in demo, as you can see, the title for the page, so the page name, really, I think that we've gone over this before a couple of times. And then you have the body, which is the rest of the white space that's down below. And within the body, you can have various tags like H1, H2. I mean, looking at this, you can have a head, a header, H group, HR, HTML, H1 through 6. You can go with div, which we're going to be focusing on that when we're developing. And this is going to primarily just be, if you want to think about it, it's more like a box in a sense. You can tell the web page what's within the box. You can tell the web page what the box looks like. There's various characteristics, which is CSS, or cascading style sheets. And those are used to define the style rules that a div must follow. Honestly, it's generally true of basically all tags. But we'll start out with an H1. That H1 is going to be, so an H1 is defined as like the biggest header So you have the head of the page, which is referring to the top, and this is where we're going to store stuff like link to a CSS class or something. I don't know. When we get that far, we'll get that far. But for right now, we're just going to focus on this. And H1 is generally something. So when you go to a web page like Facebook or something, they'll have an H1. And as a general rule, if it says H1, you should only have one on a web page. If it says H2, you can have a couple. And then H3 you can have more, and so like the lower on the scale, so if 1 it would be the highest priority and then 6 would be the lowest. So if it's a 6, you can have them basically everywhere throughout the page depending on what you're using for. If it's 1, it's going to be at the top of the page normally. There are some exceptions to that rule, but this is just kind of an example for now. We're in the H1, we're going to say this is a demo, right? Okay, so as you notice, these are rather large, right? It being as large as it is kind of is an indicator that it's the most important. So I can show you kind of what an H6 looks like, for example. Let's see, this is a demo. Right, so you can see the difference between the two. The H1 is obviously more important than the H6. And then there's also things like P, which it stands for paragraph. And within that, as you can see, I've written this is a demo to show T how to program a web page. So the idea behind a paragraph is for separation. So like if you're writing out like 5 or 6 sentences and then you want to have another paragraph, you just basically have to put P and then right, so you can be like, see how this works, for example. The reason why you'd put them in the paragraph tag is to kind of add separation. Each of these tags, like the H1 tag, the H6 tag, the paragraph tag, the body tag, the head, and all that stuff, they all have their own various rules that they have to follow. After cleaning that up, we're going to move on to something a little bit more interesting. So we'll say that we have a div, right? And we'll say that this div has a style, and we'll say the style is a border, for example, right? So depending on the style that you want to have, there are various things, various rules that you need to follow, like how a style is defined. So for in this instance, it's a border, so we'll say 1 pixel, and then we'll say solid, and then we'll say red, right? So you can't really see it because I didn't put anything within this div, but we're gonna make up for that right now. So we're just gonna make a paragraph, and we're going to say, how does this show up? Okay, so if we look at the page, as you can see, there is a border that's red that's wrapped around what's defined as a paragraph, and there's space in between the middle here, and you can see the words that I just typed in, right? So that's kind of how you would use a style directly on the page. Now this is less common than using a CSS class, and so we're going to go over here, we're going to say new, and then it created a new file for us that doesn't actually have an extension on the end of it, but that's okay. So what we can do is we can define a class, So in a CSS, in CSS format, what you're going to end up doing is you have to have a class, right? So classes are denoted with a period, an ID is denoted with a hashtag, okay? Or a pound sign, whatever you want to refer to it as, doesn't really matter. So we're going to define a class, and this class is going to be called, we'll call it, we'll just call it T, right? And what you end up doing is you use these curly brackets right here, as you can see, and you'll hit return, and then generally it's a good idea to indent, so I generally hit the tab button, and then we'll go with border colon, so we'll say 1 pixel, so we're just going to do the exact same thing that we did in the other one, solid, and then we'll say red, right? So this is the exact same styling that we did, and I'm just going to save this. And we'll save this as site.css, right? So site.css. So that's going to appear down here for right now. And then what we need to do is we actually need to make a link to the CSS, so that way the index page has access to it. Make the index page have access to the CSS. As a formatting rule, we need to put this in the head. And then you're going to say something like link, and then you'll say href. And then you're going to come down here, and normally you'd have to just type this out if you're going to do it in like a Notepad or Notepad++, but because we're using brackets, we can do it this way. Okay? And the only thing that we're going to need to change on the page right now is actually this part right here where we put style. Instead of saying style, we're going to say class equals double quotes, and then we're going to say T, right? And then if I did that right, I assume I named this correctly, dot T and T. Did I did say red, right? Border 1 pixel solid red. Oh, I see what I did wrong. I forgot to finish off the link. My bad. So you're going to say rel, and then you're going to say, so rel is basically just trying to indicate what exactly it is. For CSS, you're going to say style sheet down here. Style sheet, if I can spell. And then you'll need to tell it what type of style sheet it is. Like there's various versions such as CSS, SCSS. There's a couple more that I can't think of right now. But for right now, all we need to know is that it's supposed to be a text/CSS. And then we need to have the closing bracket. Interesting. I always thought they had to have a closing bracket. Apparently not for this specific renderer. Okay, but as you can see, we changed the name of the the only thing that we changed on the div is we changed from having a style. So before we had style equals double quotes border, right? And then we said colon 1 pixel solid red, right? So this is actually a pretty good point as for why, when I mentioned earlier, they don't normally put styles directly on the page like this, or at least I think I mentioned it earlier. If you put a style directly on the page, it's going to supersede any class that you have on this specific object. So the div, or the box if you think about it. So if you write directly on the box saying that it's got a border that's 1 pixel and it's a solid border and that the border's red, it's going to supersede something like if I were to come over here and I change this to green, right? And then I go back to the index page, it still shows up as red, which is not exactly what we were trying to do, because obviously that's why we created the style sheet, so we didn't have to define stuff like this. And the reason that we have the style sheet right here is that if there's multiple things that we want to define, so there's multiple spaces, we'll say, so like if we have more than one div, we can come up here and we can say this div has a class of we'll say F, right? Or Frosty. We'll just call it Frosty, right? And in here we're going to say that this has a paragraph, and within this paragraph we can say showing how this works. Okay, so because I have a class named Frosty and a class named T, these two can have either the same rule. So for instance, all I would have to do is say comma, dot, and then Frosty, and now they both are named, or they both have this exact same rule. But say that I wanted to have something else, like we'll say Frosty in this instance has, let me bring that back, has a background color, if I can manage to type, of, we'll say aqua, right? So I can also define it like this. So I can say that Frosty has an initial border that's one pixel wide, that's solid in green, so you see the green border. But then I also say that Frosty, the specific class, is aqua for a background color, right? So the reason I'm going over this a little bit is mainly to show you that these style rules, as they're referred to, they're going to be used when we're developing the game that we're going to get to, probably in the next episode. But for right now, we kind of just need to understand a little bit about how all of this is supposed to be working. So let's go back to the main page. Now, there's something called an ID. So the reason you have an ID and you have a class, those are two separate things. They could be the exact same thing, they could be something different. An ID is specific to an object. So think about your name, for example, right? So if we say T, we're referring specifically to you, whereas if we say niece, I mean, how many cousins do you have that are females, that are little girls? So they would all be my niece. So the idea is an ID is a specific individual, whereas a class is referring to a group of individuals that fit a specific requirement, we'll say. Alright, I think that just about covers what I wanted to show you in this first bit. So I remember there's one more thing I want to cover with you, and that would be how to display an image on a web page. An image is displayed through the image tag, so IMG, and then for an IMG tag it's defined already as for like what the rules are, but you can change the width and the height of the image depending on how you want to display it. The main thing that you need to remember is that an image needs to have a source. So if you type in src, which stands for source, and then you hit equals, and then you can go with the double quotes, and you'll come down and you'll say puppy, right? We'll define it as a puppy, and then we'll say that. And as you can see, the image tag knows exactly the way it needs to display. so it's going to display the full image. Now, depending on how many pixels, which is something that we'll have to cover later, how many pixels the image is, you might have to redefine the width and the height, or select which part of the image you want to display. But there's actually another thing that we can do with images for the web. So the other thing that we can do is we can say the background of the body is a specific image. So the body is referring to the entire page. So we'll type in body. This is on the CSS page, keep in mind, because it's important to remember to do these types of things in the right location. And the reason that we're doing it here is so that way if we have another style sheet for some reason, we just need to remember which order it is, or which style sheet we defined the body on. Whereas for the image tag, this was literally just an image that we put directly onto the page. This one is going to be the background of the overall page. So you're going to type in background dash image, and then colon space URL brackets double quotes, and then you're going to come down here. In my instance, I can come down here and you're going to type in aurora.jpg, and then remember to put a colon, and that should be good. Interesting. Alright, I figured it out, and it's because your uncle can't spell. So I was missing the R in background, and that's the reason why it showed up incorrectly. And as you can see right now, it's kind of doing a tiling effect, and that's because the overall size of the image is smaller than the size of the web browser. So it's defaulting to tile rather than just showing one instance of the image, which is fine. And if I guess I can just kind of show you what it looks like. I'm gonna cut this for now, which removes that. You can see the background, which is an aurora borealis, and then you can put the image back. And that pretty much covers everything. Actually, no, that does cover everything that I wanted to talk to you about for the initial demo. Now, the next episode, or I should say the next video, what we're going to be covering is we're going to be going over how to do some of this with JavaScript. And then we'll probably start just like the framework of what we're going to need to be able to start developing a game. And thank you all for listening. This is Frosty Turtles. Until next time, stay frosty.